Hello, my name is Dave Bowden, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. There are so many elections happening nationwide in 2020, and at Ballotpedia, we're all like kids getting ready for Christmas, as weird as that sounds. Of course, there's the presidential race, there's races for the US Senate, US House of Representatives. There's also a handful of state executives. But one set of elections that takes place pretty regularly are the contests for seats in the respective state legislatures. This year, 44 states are holding these elections in either the state house or state senate or both in their respective states. Now, state legislators may not get the lion's share of attention, but the folks who make state policy can be pretty significant. And these contests may be especially important this year because in many states, congressional and state legislative redistricting is done by the state legislatures. So with so many state legislative elections, Ballotpedia has developed some different ways to analyze them in what we call our competitiveness report. It's something that we've been doing for about 10 years now, and we just released the annual report just in the last few weeks. So with almost all of statewide primaries complete, we thought it would be a good time to delve into this topic a little bit more in a briefing, which is where we are today. So to help me do that is Doug Kronezel, a staff writer on our Marquee team. Doug, it's great to have you with us.
Happy to be here, Dave.
All right, so let's start out with an overview by talking about this competitiveness report that I mentioned. What is it and what does it tell us?
The competitiveness report is Ballotpedia's wide-scale analysis of state legislative elections. So this year, we sifted through all 5,875 seats up for election to determine how competitive those elections were. We break things down by state, by chamber, and party so that readers can get a close look at where competitiveness is higher, where it's lower, and how it compares to previous years. Are elections more competitive today than they were last year? What about in my particular state? Are there more Democrats running or Republicans? These are all questions that the report seeks to illustrate, which is helpful because, like you mentioned, especially in a presidential election year, some of these state legislative races can be glossed over, but it's still important that we have that information available.
Yeah, definitely. And I know when people hear the word competitive, they often think about elections that are decided by really, thin margins, just a handful of votes. But that's not how we're defining it here, correct? I mean, broadly speaking, what does competitiveness mean in this report?
Yeah, that's right. Rather than singling out those battleground races, our competitiveness report takes a look at all state legislative elections to determine how much competition there was as this year in general. So it could be a wave year for one party or the other, but still be a competitive cycle depending on how much competition took place before the final results were tallied.
Okay, so then how do we at Ballotpedia calculate competitiveness then?
We take a look at three factors when discussing competitiveness. The first is the number of open seats, which are races where an incumbent is not seeking re-election.
And what impact does that have on competitiveness?
Incumbents tend to enjoy advantages over their challengers. In fact, a Ballotpedia analysis of state legislative elections since 1972 showed that the win rate for incumbents seeking re-election has not dropped below 88%, meaning almost 9 out of 10 incumbents seeking re-election are regularly re-elected. Additionally, the presence of an incumbent can often dissuade others from mounting challenges, whether that's in the primary or the general election. So when a seat is open, it tends to draw out more competition.
All right, that makes sense. So open seats, that's the first or one of the three factors. What are the other two?
When incumbents do seek re-election, we track the number of races where they have contested primaries. So when a primary is uncontested, the incumbent advances directly to the general election. Therefore, a higher number of incumbents in contested primaries indicates a greater level of competitiveness. That's the second factor. The third is major party competition.
All right, so major party here refers to Democrats and Republicans.
Exactly. And so this is a fascinating metric because it effectively gives us a snapshot of how many state legislative elections have already been decided simply because only one of the two major parties is running. So if you have a seat where the only candidate is a Republican, You know that there's no Democrat there, that's effectively guaranteed to the Republican. And then vice versa. If there's a race where there's only a Democrat, no Republican, then it's guaranteed to the Democrat. So races with major party competition, meaning Democrats and Republicans both running for the same seat, are more competitive than those where only one of the two major parties is present.
All right, so that all makes sense. So the three factors, we've got open seats, incumbents and contested primaries, and looking at major party competition. All right, once we have all of that info, which sounds like a ton of data, what does Ballotpedia do with it?
Yeah, we use all that data. We use those factors to calculate a competitiveness index for each state, meant to give a quick competitiveness snapshot before diving into those details. The index ranges from 0 to 100, with a higher number indicating a more competitive electoral field and a lower number indicating the opposite. That index is determined by taking the percentages of open seats, incumbents in contested primaries, and races with major party competition, and then averaging them.
All right, that makes a lot of sense, and that's a great overview. All right, this seems like as good a place as any to start digging into some of the data. And then with this being our 10th annual report, I think we can, for the first time, conduct a review of what this has been like throughout the decade. So where does 2020 rank in competitiveness, in comparison to other election cycles with regard to competitiveness?
Overall, the 2020 state legislative elections have an average competitiveness index of 33.4 on that scale of 0 to 100. This is a decrease, meaning less competitive compared to 2018, but 2018 saw one of the highest levels of competitiveness in the past decade. If you compare 2020 to 2016, which was the most previous presidential election year, the elections this year are more competitive. The competitiveness index for the entire decade, taking into account all of the metrics from 2010 to 2020, is 33.
Okay, that's a great baseline of information to have. All right, are there any specific trends we can see when we look back at elections since 2010?
So it's really interesting to look at those presidential election years versus the midterm years. We've seen higher competitiveness scores in the midterm elections during a president's first term. So for Barack Obama, elected in 2008, that was 2010, which had the highest competitiveness score of the decade at 36.2. For Donald Trump, elected in 2016, that was the midterms in 2018, which had the second highest at 36.0. What's interesting, though, is that 2014, the midterm during Obama's second term, had the lowest competitiveness score of the decade at 31.4.
That's a really fascinating observation. Essentially saying the first midterm after a new president takes office, and both of these last two instances saw such high numbers. Do we have any idea what drove that increased competitiveness in those 2 years that we didn't see in the other election cycles?
It looks like the main driver in both of those peak competitiveness years was an increase in major party competition. In 2010, 67.4% of all the seats up for election were contested by both parties. In 2018, that was 66.8%. This means you had more Democrats and Republicans facing each other in general elections in those years compared to others. So if you take a look at that chart there on your screen, you can see the party breakdown. The red bars indicate the seats contested only by Republicans, meaning no Democrats. Blue represents those seats only contested by Democrats, not Republicans. The gray bars indicate the remaining seats, which were contested by both Democrats and Republicans. The bigger the gray bar, the more major party competition.
All right, so let me see if I have this right with this partisan data. If you look at the red and gray bars in the same row, that'll tell you the total number of races contested by Republicans. And if you combine the blue and gray bars in a row, that's all the races with a Democrat. So given that, what can we discern from that?
Well, for starters, the larger gray bars in 2010 and 2014 show us those spikes, 2010 and 2018, show us those spikes in major party competition we were talking about. But with that partisan data, we also see partisan spikes in those midterm elections in what looks like a response to the election of the new president.
All right, that sounds familiar. I mean, Barack Obama was obviously Democrat, elected in 2008. And as we know, the Tea Party movement kind of began shortly thereafter, made up of Republican candidates that entered the scene in 2010. And I guess that's being reflected right here in the data at the state legislative level.
Yeah, that's exactly right. While this doesn't show us how many of those Republican candidates in 2010 were affiliated with the Tea Party movement, we do know that the state legislative elections that year saw the most seats contested by Republicans than at any other point in the past decade, with Republican candidates contesting 85% of all seats up for election. And then if you look at 2018, following the election of Donald Trump, a Republican, we see 88% of all seats contested by Democrats, the highest number for that party within the past decade. So it looks like state legislative elections appear to see an influx of candidates from the president's opposing party following that president's initial election, which in turn has impacted competitiveness by increasing major party competition overall, because seats that were otherwise uncontested in other cycles had major party competition in those peak cycles.
That's a really, really fascinating insight. Makes a lot of sense, basically, from what we've heard anecdotally in those years. But this is really the data that kind of brings that point home. That's a really, really neat trend. All right. So you also mentioned previously that 2020 was more competitive than the most recent presidential election, which was obviously 2016. And looking at this chart, it looks like there's more major party competition this year too.
So that's been really interesting to see. Like I mentioned before, presidential election years have tended to see less major party competition within the past decade. 2020 seems to be bucking that trend, though, with an above average level of major party competition. It'll be interesting to see after the presidential election this year and the midterms in 2022, whether this is an abnormality or if we're starting to see fewer uncontested elections as part of a larger trend.
Right, and of course, a big determining factor in which trend this becomes a part of is the outcome, of course, of the presidential election, whether or not it continues a second term for the president or if there's a change in administration. So this is all great stuff. It's exactly what these kind of competitiveness reports are so helpful in illustrating. All right, so now that we've taken a look at some of these historical trends, which has been awesome, let's jump into some of these 2020 details. And I guess the hardest thing about talking and looking about these reports, I mean, I loved it because I was just, wading into the data wherever I could. But they're kind of full of so much data from party breakdowns, chamber-specific data, et cetera. I'm sure that there's a lot we could talk about. You and I could probably be here for a couple hours. But let's stick with kind of those three main competitiveness factors. So we just finished talking about major party competition. And let's take a little bit of a look at open seats. So what can you tell us about retiring incumbents in 2020?
That there aren't a lot of them. 85% of incumbents are running for re-election this year, and that is the highest rate we've seen since we started producing these reports.
Wow, that's interesting. So what does that mean for 2020 and also looking ahead for 2021?
Well, for starters, like we mentioned before, more incumbents means fewer open seats, and fewer open seats means less competitiveness. But looking beyond that, open seats are one of the ways we can tell how many legislators are guaranteed to be newcomers in the next legislative session. So when more incumbents are running for re-election, the number of guaranteed newcomers goes down. In 2020, looking at open seats alone, we know that 15% of the candidates elected in November will be guaranteed newcomers in the 2020 sessions, a decade low.
Yeah, that will be interesting. I'm sure there's some academic work as to whether or not the percentage of newcomers in a state legislative chamber may have something to do with the, I don't know, pace of legislation in that chamber. It's kind of a subject for another day. But with all of these incumbents who are not seeking reelection, I imagine some of them probably made the decision to retire, run for another office. But I would imagine a chunk of them also are in states with term limits, which obviously define how long a legislator can remain in office. Any clues to what the impact is there?
That's a great question. Of the 15 states with term limits, 14 are holding elections this year. And we saw the lowest number of term-limited legislators this year compared to any other cycle within the past decade. So that could be contributing to the higher rate of incumbents seeking re-election. However, if you look at that map on your screen there, if you look at the 5 states with the highest rates of open seats, you'll see that all 5 are states with term limits: Montana, Missouri, Florida, South Dakota, and Nevada. In fact, in the Missouri State Senate, 47% of incumbents up for election were term limited this year.
Wow. Wow. So it's very much a state-specific effects there. So open seats overall are lower this year. Some states, particularly the ones you mentioned, will still see some large turnovers from incumbents to newcomers in 2021. How about those incumbents who actually are in fact running for re-election? Are there many primaries?
Well, with the 85% of incumbents running for re-election, 79.6% of them advanced to the general election without a primary. That means about 20.4% of the 4,994 incumbents seeking re-election faced contested primaries this year. That's shown there on the chart there, which is below the decade average of 21.7%. Looking back over the previous years, though, we see that the number of Democratic incumbents facing primary challenges increased in 2018 and remained elevated in 2020. The opposite occurred for Republican incumbents, with fewer facing contested primaries in 2018 and 2020 compared to 2014 and 2016.
That's a really interesting partisan breakdown. All right, with that partisan data, can you tell us where in the country did Democrats face the most primary competition versus Republicans?
Yeah, for Democratic incumbents, that would be West Virginia, where a little under half of all Democratic incumbents faced primary challenges. Washington, Hawaii, California, and Tennessee followed. For Republican incumbents, it is Alaska, where 17 of the 28 incumbents, which is roughly 61%, faced primary challenges. Wyoming, California, West Virginia, and New Hampshire followed.
No, that's very interesting about Republicans in Alaska, because if people might recall, Republicans won the majority in that chamber in 2018, but they were unable to form a majority after 4 Republicans joined 15 Democrats and a couple of independents, and they formed a bipartisan majority.
Yes, and that was definitely a big factor in several of those Republican primaries we saw in Alaska this year, with some noteworthy incumbents defeated, which we'll touch on in just a second.
Okay, yeah, that's really neat. All right, so taking a step back a little bit from the partisan data, which states then had the most and fewest total incumbents, both Democratic and Republican, see contested primaries this year?
Sure, with Democratic and Republican incumbents combined, the state with the most incumbents facing primaries was Wyoming, where 52% of incumbents seeking re-election faced challengers. That is actually the only state where over half of incumbents running for re-election faced challengers. The state with the fewest incumbents facing primaries was Connecticut, where 4% of the 169 incumbents seeking re-election faced primaries. Now, it's worth noting that in Connecticut's case, the state holds conventions in addition to primaries. A candidate can win a contested convention outright and avoid a primary. In our analysis, we don't include convention competition in our competitiveness data, since those aren't open to public votes.
Okay, yeah, and it just kind of brings to mind all of the different quirks and peculiarities of each different state's election system. Which makes it sometimes a little bit challenging to do these kind of state-by-state comparisons. All right, with incumbents facing contested primaries, that also leads to the potential for an incumbent to be defeated in a primary, which is, of course, something that tends to gather a decent amount of news attention when it happens. So I know we're just about done with the primaries, but what does that look like so far this year?
So far, 43 Democratic incumbents have lost in primaries, including 2 noteworthy incumbents, which we define as a member of party leadership. So those 2 incumbents were the New Mexico Senate President pro tempore, Mary Kay Pappen, and New York Assemblyman Felix Ortiz, who is the Assistant Speaker of the Assembly. For Republicans, 86 incumbents have been defeated, including 4 noteworthy incumbents. As I mentioned, 2 were from Alaska. You've got Senate President Catherine Giessel and the House Rules Committee Chairman Charles Kopp, a member of that bipartisan majority leadership. Arizona's Senate President pro tempore Sylvia Allen was also defeated, as well as West Virginia's Senate President Mitch Carmichael. It's worth noting that in his capacity as Senate President, Carmichael also served as West Virginia's de facto lieutenant governor.
Yeah, so I would imagine at some point at the start of the next session, West Virginia will have to elect a new, a new Senate president. But that's interesting. Those folks those incumbents in party leadership who end up losing in their primary. So there's going to be changes imminent in those states at the very least. Of course, other states can change members of their leadership as well. But we've gone through now these three factors: the major party competition, the number of open seats, and incumbents facing primaries. So with all of that information in mind, do we have an idea of the least and most competitive states this year for state legislature?
We definitely do. We definitely do. The states with the lowest competitiveness scores and in turn the least competitive elections are Illinois, Rhode Island, Arkansas, Delaware, and with the lowest index of 13.5, Massachusetts, which we can take a closer look at to see sort of where that score comes from. Over 90% of the incumbents are running for re-election this year, leaving 15 of the 200 seats open, all of which are in the lower chamber in the House. In the state Senate, every incumbent is seeking re-election. So fewer open seats means less competitive elections. Of those 185 incumbents seeking re-election, 162 advanced to the general election without a primary. That's around 88%. And so the lower rate of incumbents facing primary challenges leads to less competitive elections. And then finally, as for the general elections, out of those 200 seats up, roughly 4 in 5 lack major party competition, meaning they're effectively guaranteed to one party or the other. 140 seats are guaranteed to Democrats because no Republican filed. 19 are guaranteed to Republicans due to the lack of Democratic competition. And that's actually the lowest rate of major party competition in the country this year.
All right, so that's a great breakdown as to why Massachusetts has such a low competitiveness index. What states have the highest scores this year? That is the most competitive elections.
Those would be Florida, California, New Hampshire, West Virginia, and with the most competitive electoral field, Michigan. On that scale of 0 to 100, these 5 states had those indices ranging from 41.9 to 50.4. So let's take a closer look at Michigan to see what contributed to its high score. Roughly 1/4 of the 110 seats up for election were open. 13 of those seats were held by Democrats and 13 were held by Republicans. You might recall that nationwide, the open seats were around 15%, so this is above average. Of those remaining 84 incumbents running for re-election, 24, around an above average 30%, had contested primaries, which means the remaining incumbents all advanced to the general election without a primary challenge. However, the general election is without Michigan this year. Of the 110 seats up for election, all but one have major party competition. Michigan tends to have a great deal of such competition. In 2018, every seat up for election was contested by both parties, giving Michigan the highest rate of major party competition in both 2018 and 2020.
All right, well, that's a very, very fascinating breakdown of the top 5 and the bottom 5 states in this index. And all of this has been really, really fascinating, Doug. Thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
I enjoyed being here. Thank you.
All right, so I'm sorry we didn't get time to answer questions because we're pretty much right up against time here. But if you send your question to editor@ballotpedia.org, we'll route it to Doug and he will try to get you an answer. So I apologize for that. All right, as I said in my intro, we're getting ready for what will be a jam-packed election year. And as we mentioned earlier, we're now officially at the end of the primary calendar. Delaware held the last statewide primary in the nation yesterday. So we can, all of us will now be focusing our attention on the general election. Of course, there's the presidential race, which becomes a primary topic of conversation. And you can follow that both on site and on our daily newsletter. The first general election debate between President Donald Trump and Joe Biden is September 29th, and that's 2 weeks from yesterday in Cleveland, Ohio. So we'll have full coverage of that and all the goings on in the race for the White House. And the best way to keep on top of what's going on is in our newsletters. There's the daily presidential news briefing and the weekly presidential news briefing, and you can find links to sign up for those on our front page. I also wanted to highlight our new app called My Vote. It's actually not that new. It's actually been out for a while. It's really, really cool. You can use this to access our sample ballot tool. You can learn more about the candidates that you'll be voting for. So if you go to the App Store and download it, it's free. Once again, it's called My Vote. It's really handy, and you'll definitely want to check that out. And then, of course, you'll want to visit our homepage daily to stay on top of all of the political news, and that's at www.ballotpedia.org. It also has a new look, which I really think that you'll like. And finally, we invite you to keep in the know with all of our email newsletters. That includes the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday. And we also have a set of weekly newsletters called The Tap. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for watching.
Thank you, everyone.